Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining Prescriptive Data Solutions today. Little housekeeping, if you'd please submit all questions and comments into the chat room. We'll address those at the end of the presentation. I just want to welcome you, Joe Galvan, and myself, Stephen Sepulveda. We'll dive into a very hot topic that we're hearing from many of our customers around cyber resilience. As we know, cyber attacks continue to evolve in both frequency and sophistication. Recovery is just as important as prevention. We'll discuss why traditional recovery strategies are being challenged and what organizations can do to improve their cyber resilience. To understand why cyber recovery has become such a critical topic, we first need to look at the threat landscape organizations are facing today. So the threat landscape is brutal. Cyber attacks are no longer rare events or isolated incidents. They become a daily business risk, impacting organizations of every size and at every industry. The data clearly shows that the speed, sophistication, and financial impact of cyber threats continue to grow. What stands out to me is these statistics are all connected. 73% of organizations have experienced ransomware, with nearly half of all breaches involve ransomware, and 90% involve compromised identities. Attackers understand that if they can compromise identities and target backups, which 94% now attempt to do, they can significantly increase downtime, which is now averaging nearly 24 days, and typically costs organizations more than $5 million per incident. Go ahead, Joe. So the core issue, backups are not the same as recovery. What we mean by that is the core issue is that backups protect data, but recovery restores the business. Without a clear understanding of business priorities, dependencies, and recovery processes, organizations often discover that having backups is not enough when a cyber event occurs. Most recovery plans are built around technology components rather than business priorities. Without clearly defining the business impact of downtime, organizations risk restoring systems in the wrong order. This can lead to extending the disruption of critical operations for an organization. What I see is most organizations know how to restore systems, but far fewer know how to recover the business. What is cyber recovery? So when most people hear the term cyber recovery, they think about restoring data. In reality, cyber recovery is much broader. It's the ability to restore trusted day-to-day operations after a cyber event. The ultimate goal is to minimize business disruption and restore operational confidence as quickly as possible. Achieving that outcome requires more than just backups. It requires a strategy that protects, isolates, validates, and prioritizes recovery based on business impact. Now that we've defined what cyber recovery is, the next question becomes, how do organizations build these capabilities needed to achieve this? Here's Joe Galvan to dive into the 4 pillars of cyber recovery and where they come into play. Joe, you're muted.
Apologies for that, everyone. Thank you for the handoff and introduction there, Stephen. So today we'd like to talk to you. What we've kind of encapsulated in terms of the effort of having successful recovery operations, kind of broken down by 4 pillars, right? And so, as you see here on the slide presented, pillar 1 would be really starting with doing a business impact analysis and understanding how to prioritize at an application level what's most important to your organization to recover, right? And that may be defined by different guidelines for different businesses. We'll get into that a bit more in a moment. The second pillar is really defining, based on that business impact, how are we going to go about recovering that data in articulating that in the form of a plan, right? So what are the systems that we're recovering? What are the steps that we're taking? Who's taking those steps, and who's signing off with authorizations of clear to proceed? The third pillar is in exercise of either testing that plan, or in reality doing that plan, being able to do that in an isolated fashion, right? So it's extremely important when there's cyber events that organizations are able to bring their applications online, ensure that they're clean, right? That they're restored previous to the point of infection, that it's clean, but also validate that those applications come up correctly, right? That they're able to do that, because unfortunately in a cyber event, you're not able to just restore systems in place, right? Because if you do it that way, it's really hard to prevent against things like reinfection. And then the fourth pillar is doing continuous testing. And really what we mean by continuous testing is not just running recovery jobs, but really putting the business through continuous exercises to practice as a business and an organization, and not just simply IT, right? Those applications that could be revenue facing for a business, or extremely critical to the business for safety or whatever reason, there's more stakeholders involved. There's the application owners, right? There's the business owners that really need to be involved and understand what that recovery effort might look like. Diving farther in, first pillar, which is the business impact, really it's about focusing on what matters. We say here, not what's easiest. If you think back to traditional backups, it's been about, hey, we're protecting at a systems level. We're backing up a VM or physical server, and we may be doing some things like application aware backups for things like SQL or Active Directory or various things, but not necessarily thinking that as a broad ecosystem and at a full application that may have multiple servers and different dependencies involved in having that application online and available. A lot of organizations kind of approach the cyber recovery initially as, hey, we're doing those standard backups, right? And then in the midst of trying to recover from a cyber event, they might not even have a chance to bring those online because they haven't planned around isolation. And maybe it's the insurance claim, you're working with an external entity to help you do that recovery. They're not going to give you the ability to recover those systems in place because they need that for forensics data. So there's all kinds of reasons why it's really important to think about the applications holistically, and then also everything else you need to do around that. So our recommendation is typically, focus on what matters to the organization. If you're a for-profit company, typical way to think about that is any sort of revenue generation impact. You're unable to invoice, you're unable to run the cash register, whatever that might be, right? Those are typically the things that are thought of first. Maybe if you're a nonprofit or doing other types of things, right? Maybe there's a public good, right? Or some other thing that your organization's mission statement is to do those things. And certainly, things like safety, right? If there's field operations or critical communications, that your great workforce is out there at risk, right? Those are other things to consider along with the revenue impact. So again, don't focus on what's easiest to restore and solve. There's lots of different ways to back up the applications and the other dependencies. And that's really what it's about, is kind of thinking about all of those things, and then really driving that based on the prioritization of, application disruption. So really, when you're doing the business impact analysis, you really want to, the goal is to get a list of applications designated by tier 0 and 1 being applications that you absolutely cannot run without, and defining an objective, an SLA around you know, what your recovery time needs to be and what granularity could you recover to from a recovery point perspective. So a lot like DR or even backups in those aspects, those may be somewhat aspirational in a real event, right? But at least defining how frequently you're making copies, immutable copies to recover, and defining the expectation of the recovery time, you can build your solution around that to help fulfill those goals. And then one other thing that's super important from a business impact analysis standpoint is making sure that when you're looking at things from an application level, that it's fully mapped out, right? It can't just be, hey, we have a front end web server, a middleware app server, and a database server, when all of those things are relying on things like identity for access and authentication, right? Maybe it's Active Directory. Your DNS, right? So that people can resolve those systems names and be able to get access to those applications, whether that's internal or external. The networking that's involved in terms of the connectivity being there from an on-prem routability and layer 2 connectivity. And then really importantly and often overlooked are other application dependencies, right? Maybe it's encryption keys that are external, or maybe you have third-party vendors that you use that integrate into your inventory system, right? And they need to be able to have access to this once promoted to production to make updates, right? Your business relies on those entities to be able to reach these applications. Moving on to the second pillar, which is really the cyber recovery plan. If you think about this in a series of phases, the first thing that happens is that you detect an event happened, right? And you know that something within your environment is compromised. That may be in the form of a nasty ransom note on your VMware data stores, right? It could be encryption at a file server level. It could be suspicious activity in terms of your identity provider, right? So it could be different types of scenarios of things that could happen, right? And the first thing is detecting what that is. The second step would be kind of containing it, right? To know that, hey, these systems are compromised. We're going to contain that and try to understand the surface scape of the attack, right? And once a handle is you kind of have a good idea of what that is, then and only then can you kind of move on to starting to say, hey, we know when this system was compromised. It's a file server at this time at this day. It was encrypted, right? And so, okay, here's when we need to roll that specific thing back to, right? But you don't want to just roll that back and restore it to inline because you risk running into the same problems, right? So really doing an isolated recovery, whether that's a bubble net, if it's one particular thing affected or if it's more global, definitely recommend kind of more of a clean room approach if it's possible. We'll get into that a little bit more later, where you'd have a dedicated kind of landing zone for clean room recovery. And then once all that the systems are restored, things have been validated, you've put your application testers and owners on to sign off that, hey, this application's functioning normally in our test restore environment. Ultimately, what you would do is promote that restored environment to production, right? And make that routable and accessible, resolvable to the outside world or internally, just depending on what the needs are for that given application. So the idea behind all this is that it's a holistic plan that takes all those elements into account, how you're defining how you do that as an organization, and putting everybody together in a room, business operations, security, as well as IT, to move cohesively throughout this process and understanding what folks are doing at each step, right? And following the plan. So having a defined plan and authority defined around who makes what decisions is pretty key. And also knowing how you're going to recover, what the plan calls for in terms of the recovery mechanism, is critical so that, in the event something like this happens, it's not a scramble and competing voices in a room of what to do next. So really designating those roles and responsibilities between the decision makers, the recovery process owners, who would be IT, really owning the recovery process itself, and then the application owners and validators, who would check out and authorize, hey, this application looks good to go, looks like we're recovered, let's move forward with promoting to production. Moving on to the third pillar, it's really about being able to provide that isolated recovery. When you have sweeping disruption, things like all of our data stores have been compromised, none of our ESX infrastructure is usable, right? Lots of times, as I talked to before, spoke a little bit about before, if you're going through a cyber insurance claim, they're going to want you to make copies of the encrypted data stores before you're able to repurpose any of that infrastructure, right? So particularly on the production side. So if you can have kind of a tertiary clean room recovery that enables you to start that recovery process earlier, there are ways to kind of work around that within system. It's just more legwork, more effort, more process that would have to be put forward. So at the end of the day, it's not really about speed. It's about ensuring that you can do a clean recovery process, have that validated, and completely avoid reinfection. So really, what's involved in terms of providing that clean room recovery? First and foremost, it's about ensuring that you have good backups, that they're immutable, they can't be altered in any way, encrypted, deleted. That way you have something to recover from. Again, I think we may have cited a stat, but these days the backups themselves are typically something that the bad actors will try to go after. So if you have it on something like a share that's based on SMD AD credentials, there's a very good chance it's not going to do you much good. So really recommend having those immutable backups, ideally in the place next to your clean room recovery or where you plan to recover from, and definitely at more than one site, right? So having a copy on one site, or your primary site, for regular day-to-day recoveries, just backup territory, a second one potentially for DR/cyber events, and even a tertiary copy where it's offsite and vaulted and absolutely untouchable, just as an absolute fail-safe. So you always have a copy of that data to recover from. The next kind of perspective on the capabilities for the restore would be, again, really the isolated recovery and validation. I mentioned before, ideally, this would be dedicated infrastructure. So some amount of compute sized based on those business impact and tier 0 and 1 systems that you absolutely need to recover, having dedicated infrastructure to do that with. That dedicated infrastructure could be, buy all new hardware, get a third data center. It could be public cloud. It could also be things like a backup as a service with a platform as a service offering where you're storing those backups in the service, and on demand, you're able to recover those workloads onto that platform. It's a pretty good use case. And then another thing that's kind of been a rising trend, at least in terms of the way bad actors are going after things, right? They've always kind of gotten in because of compromised credentials, but the sophistication with which they're exploiting that, and really, hey, if you find the compromised account, you remove access. Well, they've probably already gone and used that compromised account to make additional accounts, right, and things of that nature. So we're really seeing more around, identity providers, primarily Active Directory and Entra ID, where it's imperative to really be able to do holistic application level backups of the identity provider, right? So that you can do multiple things, right? One would be the ability to do a forest level recovery, right? We all know if we back up a VM that's AD, well, theoretically, we could restore our forest based on that one VM and rolling out additional domain controller roles based on that. But if we try to recover multiple domain controllers, we're probably going to run into a lot of problems with conflict and tombstoning and things of that nature. So just more and more these days, that's been the biggest, threat vector of continuous attack is compromised identity. So we really recommend making sure that we're protecting those things in a sufficient fashion with AD or intra-ID backups that are immutable, that we can do things like granular recovery and forest level recovery. And the final pillar, and perhaps, the most important, once everything else is established within the environment, you've kind of built out your initial cyber recovery plan, you've done the business impact analysis to influence what that plan should look like, you've come up with within that plan how you're going to perform isolated recovery in different scenarios. It's all about testing, right? And if you kind of harken back to traditional DR or backup restore testing, some of those things still apply, right? You're going to need to be able to know, hey, are my backups working? Can I restore them? What is the process? Write it up as a run book, be able to execute it well. And that's certainly important. One of the things that's very different about it is you may have different scenarios, right? So what we recommend to do is, as you're doing this periodic annual or quarterly testing, we recommend annual at a minimum, is to really not have that be just an IT exercise. Bring in the other aspects of the business, the application stakeholders, business owners, security, legal, HR, whomever relies on the critical systems that you're protecting, and run through tabletop exercises that are scenario based, right? And not only do that on paper and academically, but do it as a function of restore. Ask yourself, what would happen if you could no longer trust AD, or if all your VMware data stores were encrypted, or you lost access to your storage controllers and your VM data stores were encrypted, right? Run through those exercises, look at your recovery plan, see what that would dictate in terms of, okay, these are the way we recover these things. Some of these steps from our recovery plan are going to be needed. Let's execute and test on those. And then have everybody participate in the validation, right? So not only are you making sure you're getting everyone's perspective on what that looks like, you're also setting the expectation and putting the ownership of cyber recovery onto the broader business rather than just as a function of IT, which puts IT in an unfair position because they may not know everything about, all the applications or, what we're doing with one customer and specific integration. So just very, very important to test that, right? And really put things through their paces and have a collective understanding as an organization. Some of the things that we've seen, Prescriptive, we've been through multiple, not ourselves, but throughout our customer base, cyber events, right? And they've been kind of, different ones, different threat vectors, and then different abilities by our customers, depending on where they were with things and their ability to recover. So seen a lot of different things, seen some organizations be able to recover within a day or two, and other ones, as Stephen mentioned earlier, may take 20 or 30 days for them to fully recover, right? Which is never a fun spot to be as a business or in the chair of IT either. So some of the things that we've seen historically, give challenges into that recovery. First, these days would be identity. you can't really even start until you're able to bring your IDP, identity provider, online and be able to do authorization and access. Similar to that would be DNS, right? If they get to your DNS, internal DNS or external DNS, and you're not able to restore that, that can be a challenge, right? Having to build that. So recommend backing that up in some way, right? That's outside of it as a VM. Maybe that's a zone transfer, where you're putting that some third location, or maybe you're using an enterprise DNS product that does things like versioning. The network segmentation goes back to the clean room. If you don't have a clean room or kind of designated a set of hardware, or a plan to carve out a designated set of hardware, you're really going to be challenged doing a clean restore, right? So you need the ability to segment that at a minimum at a network level. Obviously, an air gap is even better. Another thing we've seen are lost encryption keys, right? For things like database tables, the customer didn't have those recorded. They had them on a VM as a digital copy. Had actually another one that put them in their like hosted third-party password system, but that was compromised because it was tied to AD logins, which were compromised. So, and not only did they cough up all the password, they took their encryption keys and made that extremely difficult. So really recommend storing those off-site, right? Maybe it's printed out and in a safe, as silly as that sounds. Or if you want to stay digital, maybe that's putting them in an S3 bucket or something like that in the cloud, with access and not tied into things that could be compromised like AD. And then lastly, would be third-party dependencies, right? And that may be SaaS integrations that you're using, right, where you may need to be whitelisted or something like that, or maybe you have an MSP that does services for you, and they're going to need access to the restored environment, and other different, business partner integrations, like I mentioned before. You may have B2B API calls that are needed for inventory management and things of that nature. So you really want to think about those things end to end holistically. And that's why it's important to bring in the entire business, just so that, folks can provide all the information of how that's integrated and how your business operates, and particularly around the third party. So that's all pretty critical in terms of thinking of that holistically. With that, I will pass back off to Stephen.
Yeah, good job, Joe. A lot of good stuff there. So basically, in closing today, it's no longer if you'll be experience a cyber attack, it's basically when. Ultimately, cyber recovery is more about confidence, confidence that your data is protected, confidence that systems can be restored, confidence that your business can continue operating after a cyber event. So we appreciate your time today. We hope today's discussion provided some valuable insights into building a more resilient and recoverable organization. If you'd like to explore any of these topics further, please connect with your account rep. We look forward to continuing this conversation and helping you guys strengthen your cyber recovery strategy. At this time, we're going to look at the chat room and address any questions or comments. I don't see any at this time. But yeah, I just think this was really a very important conversation. A lot of customers that I talked to are a little concerned about the cyber resiliency story. They know they have backups, but there's a lot more to it, especially now with the cyber warfare that's going on and the different layers that can be impacted, and the challenges with recovery as well. So it's no longer a DR runbook; it's a cyber recovery runbook, which has all the components that Joe covered a little while ago. Joe, any final statements from yourself?
No, I mean that's kind of an introductory, right? Obviously, this was pretty high level, so definitely encourage folks that are interested to reach out. Would love to help you and your teams kind of really look at this objectively. The reason it was a bit high level is there's a lot of it depends that are environmentally specific. So we'd love to talk to you about you and your needs.
Yep. On that note, I think we're pretty much done for the day, and I appreciate again everybody's time for joining us and being part of this presentation. So thank you guys, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.